010106, creating a virtual machine. The first step is to create a blank container which represents the virtual machine configuration, and then we're going to install an operating system inside that container. To install an operating system inside that blank container, you must use the virtual machine's console. The virtual machine's console, available in the vSphere client, provides the mouse, keyboard, CD, DVD, and screen functionality. The VM console allows access to the BIOS of the virtual machine and offers the ability to power on and off and to reset the virtual machine. Let's go ahead and create a virtual machine. To do that, we can right-click in a resource pool and select New Virtual Machine, or we can right-click on the ESX server and select New Virtual Machine. I'm going to create the new virtual machine at the ESX server level, and here we can specify virtual machine configuration. We can do typical. It says it creates a new virtual machine with the most common devices in configuration options, or we can select custom. Let's select custom just so we can go through it and see all of the options. I'm going to click next. Here we can select the virtual machine name. The virtual machine's display name is used to name the files that make up the virtual machine itself. Therefore, avoid using special characters, including spaces, in the virtual machine's display name. I'm going to call this Test Server 1, and usually I like this to coincide with the machine name, but it doesn't have to. It can be longer and more descriptive. I'll click Next. Here we can select the resource pool within which you want to run this virtual machine. I can put it down in the test server's resource pool now, or I can put it at the top level resource pool, which would give it normal attributes and access to all the parent's resources. Basically, it wouldn't be limited. Click Next. Here we can specify where we're going to put the actual files for the virtual machine. Except for the log files, the name of each file starts with a virtual machine's name. Every virtual machine has a configuration file, .vmx, one or more virtual disk files, .vmdk, a file containing the virtual machine's BIOS, .nvram, a log file, .log, a swap file, .vswp, a snapshot description file, .vmsd. A virtual machine may have additional files if one or more snapshots have been taken or if raw disk mappings have been added. These are discussed further in the next movies. Now, if we had more storage on this system, which we do, we could choose the location of the VM. But since we're going to take a look at adding additional storage to our ESX server in a later movie, I will use local storage for now. I'm going to put it on only the local storage available, and notice that there's 129 gigabytes free. Click Next. Now that we have vSphere, the standard for the VM hardware is version 7. We have the choice between version 4 and version 7. There are a number of enhancements in VM hardware version 7. The new ESX Server 4 supports USB. The new virtual hardware in ESX has some cool new features like virtual machine hot plug support. The new virtual hardware introduced in ESX/ESXi4 Point X provides support for adding and removing virtual devices, like virtual CPUs and memory to a virtual machine without having to power off the virtual machine. Also, we have the option to assign more memory. Up to 256 gigabytes of RAM can be assigned to a virtual machine now. Third generation para-virtualized NIC, NIC, is part of the new hardware. It's called VMX Net 3 with new features like MSI/MSIX support, receive side scaling, IPv6 checksum and TCP segmentation offloading, TSO, over IPv6, VLAN offloading, large TX-RX ring sizes. Support for 8-way virtual SMP. ESX4 Point X provides support for virtual machines with up to 8 virtual CPUs, allowing larger CPU-intensive workloads to be run on the VMware ESX platform. We also have access to new storage virtual devices. Serial Attached SCSI, SAS, virtual device for Microsoft Cluster Service, provides support for running Windows Server 2008 in a Microsoft Cluster Service configuration. IDE Virtual Device, ideal for supporting older operating systems that lack SCSI drivers. Okay, So here at the Guest Operating System screen, we can select which type of guest operating system we'd like to use. Notice we have a list of available operating systems: Microsoft, Linux, Novell, Solaris, and other. And mine's going to be Microsoft Windows. And from the drop-down menu, I'm going to select Version, Microsoft Windows Server 2008, and I'll click Next. Number of virtual processors. So this is the number of processors that will appear on the virtual machine. If we want multiple, we can have multiple. And you might notice we can bring this up to 4, and even though we don't actually have 4 physical processors on this machine, we can specify 8 if we'd like. If you have purchased the virtual SMP product, you may take advantage of that purchase by selecting 1, 2, or more processors. Keep in mind, though, that many guest OS application combinations are not enhanced by the additional CPU. 2, 4, or more vCPU VMs should be created only in the comparatively infrequent instances where they are of benefit, not as a standard configuration. I'm going to select 1. Click Next. Memory for this virtual machine, I'm going to go ahead and let me select it here. I'm going to give it 2 gigabytes. Click Next. Although the vSphere client interface may provide a default memory size for your VM at the time of creation, make sure you understand the memory needs of your application and guest OS and size accordingly. The maximum memory size allowed for any VM is 256 gigabytes. Memory size is the maximum amount of memory that the virtual machine will see. NICs. How many NICs do we want to connect? We can do 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'm going to select 1, and we'll look at creating networks later. But notice I have 4 different networks. The one I use for regular network traffic is VMN1 network. And we want to connect it power on. This is important to have it checked. Otherwise, when your machine powers on, the network won't be available. So I'll click Next. SCSI adapter. We can use bus logic, LSI logic, or VMware Paravirtual. Adding the first virtual disk implicitly adds a virtual SCSI adapter for it to be connected to. ESX Server offers a choice of either a virtual LSI logic adapter, virtual bus logic adapter, or a Paravirtual adapter. The virtual machine creation wizard in the vSphere client automatically selects the type of virtual SCSI adapter based on the choice of guest OS. I'm going to go ahead and keep it on LSI Logic SAS. Click Next. Virtual disk. We can use an existing virtual disk if we'd like. Let's say we've got a virtual hard disk VMDK file from another virtual machine, and we want to move it over or copy it over and just attach it to this virtual machine. We can do that if we'd like. Or we can just create a new one. There's also the new option to use raw device mapping. I'm going to select Create a New Virtual Disk, and I'll click Next. Disk capacity. Let's specify it at 40 gigabytes. We have this new feature here where we can specify how do we want to provision the virtual disk. Other disk provisioning, we can choose to either thin provision the disk and/or add support for fault tolerance. If you select Allocate and Commit Space on Demand, thin provisioning, you will be only using the disk space you need. Traditionally with virtual machines, if you create a 500 gigabyte virtual disk, it will use 500 gigabytes of your VMFS data store. With thin provisioning, you can create a 500 gigabyte virtual disk, but if only 100 gigabytes is in use, only 100 gigabytes of your VMFS data store will be utilized. If you don't choose thin provisioning in here, ESX Server Virtual Disk will be monolithic and pre-extended. In other words, if you make a 40 gigabyte virtual disk, the result will be a single file of size 40 gigabytes. Although thin provisioning is being heralded as something new with vSphere, the truth is it was already available in VI3. In VI3, creating a thin provisioned disk involved using VMKFS tools and was also not a production-supported VM configuration. Now in vSphere, the creation of thin provisioned disk can be carried out from the vSphere client and is a supported production configuration for a VM. If you'd like to use the super fancy new feature called fault tolerance, which we'll talk about later in this course, you not only need to check this box here, but you also need to make sure that you have a host certified by the OEM as FT capable. You can refer to the current hardware compatibility list for a list of FT supported servers. Location. Store within the virtual machine or specify the data store for this disk. Select the VMFS to hold the new blank virtual disk. You may also cite the disk at a specific virtual SCSI target ID and LUN if you wish. I'm going to just store it with the virtual machine. Click Next. Here we can specify the advanced options for this virtual disk. We can specify the SCSI ID or IDE ID if we'd like. Finally, choose the appropriate disk mode. You can change the disk mode anytime the virtual machine is powered off. If you choose Mode Independent, it says independent disks are not affected by snapshots, and we'll go over snapshots in a later section. There are two options for independent disks, either persistent or non-persistent. I'm not going to use any of these two modes, and I'll just click Next. And here's a nice summary of what we've done. We've named it Test Server 1, Host Cluster. It's the name of the server dot the name of the domain. If it's not part of a domain, it will just say local, which is ESX server. Resource pool is in the test servers, which is the root resource pool. Data store, here's our storage. Guest OS, and so on and so forth. I'll click Finish. And here's our first virtual server. Virtual server is basically a blank server. I mean, it's got processor, hard drive, it's connected to the network, it's got everything. It's just as if it was shipped to you from the manufacturer and it doesn't have an OS on it. Next, we're going to look at putting an OS on this virtual server.